Welcome to Soul Stories, where every tale speaks directly to the heart. It was a little past midnight when Elias heard the knock, three slow, deliberate taps that echoed through the narrow hallway of his cottage. At first he thought he had imagined it. The hour was too late, the world too still, and his mind had a habit of playing tricks on him when sleep hovered just out of reach. But then it came again, the same measured rhythm, as if whoever stood outside knew exactly how to pierce through silence and settle unease deep into a man's bones. Elias set down his half-finished cup of chamomile tea. The warm steam curled upward for a moment, then vanished into the cold air that seemed to seep from the very walls. He held his breath, listening. The wind outside, usually persistent and restless in these woods, had gone unnaturally quiet. Even the old oak that leaned against the cottage made no sound, not a creak, not a sigh. It was the kind of silence that didn't simply happen, it arrived. Another knock. Elias felt a tremor work its way down his spine. No one ever visited at this hour. His nearest neighbor lived nearly a mile away, and they were both old enough to understand that walking through forest paths at night was an invitation for misfortune. Travelers were rare, especially in winter, and those who wandered this far into the woods did not walk confidently enough to knock with such deliberate calm. The lantern on the table flickered as he reached for it. His hand shook, making the tiny flame dance wildly before steadying. The hallway stretched before him like a narrow tunnel, its wooden floor groaning beneath his steps. Shadows clung to the corners, shifting slightly as though whispering among themselves. He paused halfway to the door. For a brief moment, Elias wondered if he should call out, ask who was there, demand an explanation, or perhaps warn the unknown visitor that he was armed even though he was. But something held his voice captive. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like a deep, instinctive knowing that speaking aloud would change something irrevocably. The cottage felt smaller with every step he took, as though the walls were inching closer, pressing him forward, urging him to answer the summons. He reached the door at last, placing his free hand against the rough wood. It was cold, unnaturally cold, as if someone on the other side had drained the warmth from it. For a long heartbeat, Elias simply stood there, lantern trembling in his grip, breath shallow, ears straining for any hint of movement. Then, with a cautious inhale and a heart pounding far too loudly in the stillness, he lifted the latch and pulled the door open. When Elias opened the door, he expected the usual things a man might fear at midnight: a lost traveler stumbling through the dark, a desperate neighbor seeking help, or perhaps some wild creature confused by the lamplight. What he did not expect was a child. A boy stood barefoot in the thin layer of frost that coated the doorstep. Barefoot and seemingly unbothered by the biting cold. His clothes were simple, almost old-fashioned, a thin linen shirt, sleeves torn at the edges, and trousers far too short for his spindly legs. But it wasn't the clothes that froze Elias in place, it was the boy himself. He was thin as a shadow, as if one strong wind might carry him away. His pale skin caught the lantern glow like moonlight caught still water. But the most unsettling part, what rooted Elias' hand still on the doorknob, were the boy's eyes. They were wrong. Too old, too knowing. Eyes that had seen far more winters than the child's body should have allowed. Eyes that seemed to recognize Elias immediately, even though he was sure he had never seen the boy before in his life. "I can't find my home," the boy whispered. The words drifted out with a frail softness like a leaf falling at the end of autumn. Elias watched for the small puff of mist that warm breath makes in cold air. None came. His heart stumbled. A chill skittered up his spine, settling beneath his skin like an unwelcome guest. Instinct screamed at him to shut the door, bolt it, draw the curtains, pretend he had never heard the knock. Every story he had ever heard about spirits wandering the woods surged through his thoughts at once, warnings whispered by firelight, tales of children long lost who returned not quite themselves. But then the boy lifted his face. There was something in the slight tremble of his lower lip, in the subtle wobble of his posture that tugged painfully at Elias' chest. Fear, yes, but not the kind meant to threaten. It was the fear of someone truly lost, truly alone. "Please," the boy added, barely audible, "it's dark out here." The simple plea held such raw vulnerability that Elias' hand loosened on the doorknob. The lantern light caught the boy's cheeks, revealing the faint shimmer of tears, not falling but gathering as if he were fighting desperately to remain composed. Elias hesitated, torn between caution and compassion. The woods were no place for a child at this hour, and though every instinct warned him to take a step back, to protect himself from whatever strange presence had appeared on his threshold, something stronger, something deeply human, told him not to send the boy away. Slowly, Elias stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Come in," he murmured, voice barely steady. The boy crossed the threshold without a sound. Elias guided the boy into the cottage, closing the door gently behind them. The cold outside still clung to his skin, but the lantern's warm glow should have pushed it back. Instead, the light seemed to flicker strangely, as though reluctant to settle on the boy's small frame. The moment the lantern light touched him fully, the air shifted. It happened quietly at first, like the subtle change before a storm. Then the room began to stretch, bending out of shape as though the cottage itself had grown impatient with its own walls. Elias blinked rapidly, trying to steady his vision. The wooden beams overhead elongated and warped, the familiar smell of herbs and old books dissolving, replaced by damp earth and pine. "Wah!" Elias staggered back, lantern shaking. The flame stretched upward, flickering green for an instant. His cottage was gone. Around him rose towering trees, twisted, ancient, dark as ink against the faint silver light. The forest floor dipped under his boots, soft with moss and fallen needles. A distant owl hooted, though Elias knew that in this memory-haunted place not every sound belonged to something living. He hadn't been here in years. Not since that night. His throat tightened. The forest had taken something from him long ago, something he had never been brave enough to face again. But the boy stood in the center of the warped clearing, unmoving, as if he belonged to this place. Then his form flickered. For a heartbeat, Elias saw his younger brother, 12 years old, skinny, hair sticking to his forehead after hours of running through the woods with Elias chasing behind. A face he had tried to remember clearly for decades and failed. Lost, frightened, fatting. Elias' breath caught painfully. No, that's not. The boy's outline dissolved again, weaving between the child he had taken in and the brother he had lost. His voice, when it came, carried layers, young, old, living, gone. "You left me." The word struck Elias like a physical blow. He stumbled forward, reaching out instinctively, though fear clawed at his gut. "I didn't. I tried to find you," Elias whispered, voice cracking. "I searched until my feet bled." The apparition tilted its head. The forest darkened around them, shadows curling like smoke. The boy, his brother, looked at him with hollow ache in his eyes too old and too broken to belong to any child. "I waited," the apparition murmured. Elias' lantern sputtered once more and went out, plunging them into the memory he had spent his whole life trying to escape. Tears blurred Elias' vision until the forest around him became nothing more than shapes of darkness and memory. His breath trembled in his chest, thick with grief he had swallowed for decades. "I didn't know how to find you," he whispered, each word shaking loose pieces of sorrow he didn't realize he still carried. "I tried, I swear I tried." The apparition, boy and brother, past and present, watched him with eyes full of a sadness too deep for any child. Shadows curled around the figure's edges, but not the menacing kind. They felt tired, worn, like echoes of a long wait finally reaching its end. Elias reached out with a trembling hand. For a moment, he feared the child would crumble into mist, feared that this fragile moment of truth would scatter like ash in a storm. But the boy stepped forward, his bare feet silent on the forest floor, and placed his small, steady hand in Elias' palm. Warmth spread through Elias' fingers, startling in its gentleness. The forest shuddered. The towering trees dissolved first, their bark thinning into streaks of lantern light. The moss underfoot flickered away like dying embers. The cold wind quieted, replaced by the soft hum of his cottage settling into its familiar creaks and sighs. The warped world of memory peeled back layer by layer until Elias stood once more in the middle of his home, simple, modest, safe. The boy, his brother's ghost, still held his hand. He looked up at Elias with an expression so soft, so forgiving, it hurt more than any accusation. A faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, as though he were finally free of the burden that had tied him to the cold edge between worlds. "You came," the apparition whispered. "I never stopped wanting to," Elias replied, voice hoarse. The boy's fingers tightened around his for a final heartbeat. Then his outline shimmered, thinning like morning fog kissed by sunlight. His smile remained even as the rest of him faded, dissolving into a warmth that filled the room, not a heat of fire, but of peace long denied. It radiated through the cottage, filling every shadowed corner, loosening every knot in Elias' chest. The quiet that followed was not the eerie silence from before, it was comforting, familiar, almost sacred. When the last traces of the boy's presence melted into the still air, Elias found himself standing alone in his small cottage. But he no longer felt hollow. The knock at midnight had not come to haunt him, it had not come to punish or torment. It had come to heal. It had given him a chance to face the fracture in his soul, and to mend it at last.